They say blood is thicker than water, but for 29 years, the people sharing my DNA created the storms meant to drown me. I was just a mindless cash machine to my parents and sister. Have you ever wondered what happens when that machine finally says no? Listen closely. This is how a single slap on Thanksgiving night shattered my entire family, exposing the dark, expensive price of their boundless greed. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. We truly appreciate your continuous support. But unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without a budget to keep producing these videos. If you enjoy our content, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you can listen to exclusive, true, and much longer stories with intricate details and multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive into today's story about a woman named Violet Collins. My name is Violet Collins. I am 29 years old, and I work as a systems architect at Nexus Core Solutions, right in the heart of downtown Chicago. In my line of work, everything revolves around structure, logic, and eliminating chaotic errors. I fix broken systems. I troubleshoot massive corporate servers. I thrive in the cold, quiet hum of data centers because machines make sense. They follow absolute rules. If a server crashes or a network fails, there is always a perfectly logical explanation. A clear trail of code you can trace backward to locate the exact source of the problem. Unfortunately, human beings do not operate like machines, especially not the people who share my blood. For as long as I can consciously remember, I have been the invisible financial safety net for my parents, Eleanor and Arthur, and my 25-year-old sister, Chloe. I never actively volunteered to take on this exhausting role, but somewhere along the twisted timeline of our family history, my personal bank account seamlessly merged into their collective checking account in their minds. To them, my hard-earned income was never truly mine, it was ours. It started with seemingly innocent, small requests, but it quickly escalated into a suffocating avalanche of financial obligations. Over the past 5 years, I paid the exorbitant commercial rent for 3 of Chloe's completely failed startup businesses. The first was an artisanal, organic candle shop that lasted exactly 6 months before she got bored. The second was a luxury pet grooming service that folded in less than 4 months because she hated waking up early. And the third was an elite event planning company that never actually planned a single event. When the roof of my parents' house started leaking right before winter, I was the one who quietly transferred $15,000 for the emergency repairs when my father, Arthur, suddenly needed vague, out-of-pocket medical treatments that his insurance supposedly would not cover. It was my credit card that swiped at the reception desk without a single question asked. I am not someone who yells, throws tantrums, or bitterly complains. I absorbed these heavy financial blows in total silence, because trying to argue with my mother, Eleanor, was like talking to a brick wall that yelled back at you. However, I am a systems architect by trade, and I have very ingrained habits. I like tracking data. Every single time I transferred money, paid a utility bill, or covered a sudden family emergency, I saved the digital receipt. I downloaded every monthly bank statement and systematically categorized every invoice. I kept all of it securely stored away in a heavily encrypted folder on my personal laptop. I did not do it out of malice or a burning desire for revenge at the time. It was just a professional reflex to maintain a backup of the system logs, just in case everything crashed. The absolute cruelest part of my daily reality was not the thousands of dollars lost. It was the complete and utter lack of acknowledgement. If you ever walked into the Collins household and looked at the large refrigerator in the kitchen, you would genuinely think I did not exist. The refrigerator door was plastered from top to bottom with vibrant, glossy photos of Chloe. There was Chloe smiling brightly on a white sand beach in Hawaii. There was Chloe holding an expensive cocktail in Paris. There was Chloe posing in designer winter gear while skiing in Aspen. Every single one of those luxury trips was quietly and entirely funded by my paycheck. Yet, there was not a single photograph of my college graduation on that fridge. There was no mention of the day I got promoted to lead architect. I was the concrete foundation of the house, buried deep in the dark dirt, completely invisible and ignored, while my sister was the shiny paint on the walls that everyone admired and praised. The isolation I felt inside my own family was deeply suffocating. My phone only rang when a credit card bill was due, or a checking account was dangerously overdrawn. They never called to ask if I was eating well, if my back ached from sitting at an office desk for 12 hours a day, or if I was simply happy with my life. The only person who ever saw me as a living, breathing human being, and not just an automated teller machine, was my late aunt. Before she passed away, she held my hand tightly in her hospital room and gave me a haunting warning I never forgot. "Violet," she had said, her voice weak but intensely firm, "do not let them bleed you dry. You are a person, not a resource. When you have absolutely nothing left to give, they will not carry you. They will just step right over you." I thought I understood what she meant back then. I thought I was successfully managing the situation by simply staying quiet and paying the bills to keep the peace, but I had no idea just how incredibly dark the truth was, or how far my own flesh and blood would eventually go to protect their endless, unpaid supply of cash. I met Julian during a massive corporate audit at Nexus Core. He was an independent forensic accountant, brought in by the board to trace some complex anomalies in a client's legacy database, and I was the systems architect assigned to guide him through the deep server maze. Julian was incredibly sharp, meticulous, and completely immune to corporate nonsense. But what struck me the most was how he looked at me. He did not see a machine that processed tasks. He actually noticed when my eyes grew heavy after staring at bright monitors for 9 hours straight. He would quietly bring me decaf coffee and gently remind me to eat a real meal. He valued my intellect, my quiet nature, and the fact that I genuinely preferred a calm evening at home over a loud, crowded party. For the absolute first time in my life, someone wanted to take care of me instead of constantly figuring out how much I could afford to give them. After 18 months of a beautifully quiet and stable relationship, Julian asked me to marry him. I said yes without a single hesitation. The real anxiety only began when I realized I had to bring him home to formally meet my parents and sister. I prepared Julian for the worst, warning him that my family was difficult and somewhat demanding. The initial introduction went exactly as poorly as I expected. When we sat down in their overly decorated living room, my mother, Eleanor, offered a tight, terribly forced smile. My father, Arthur, barely looked up from his sports magazine. They flatly asked Julian what he did for a living, when he humbly replied that he was an accountant. The temperature in the room visibly plummeted. In their shallow eyes, a standard accountant was just an average desk worker, certainly not someone who could elevate their social standing or fund their lavish desires. Chloe dramatically rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed by his modest introduction, and went straight back to scrolling on her smartphone. The dismissive and completely arrogant atmosphere lasted for exactly 45 minutes. It completely shattered when Arthur casually asked what accounting firm Julian worked for. Likely trying to gauge his salary bracket, Julian politely explained that he did not work for a corporate firm, but rather, he owned his own independent forensic accounting agency specializing in high-net-worth corporate fraud, offshore asset recovery, and financial litigation. He casually mentioned recently closing a major case involving a massive multinational merger in New York. I watched the exact moment my mother's brain frantically calculated the financial implications of that single sentence. The sudden realization of Julian's actual wealth, his professional scale, and his obvious net worth hit her like a physical shock. The transformation was instant, dizzying, and frankly sickening. Eleanor suddenly sat up completely straight, her eyes practically glowing with unhidden greed. The frosty coldness vanished in a second, replaced by an aggressive, smothering warmth. She immediately leaped up and offered to pour him an expensive glass of vintage wine that I had bought them last Christmas. She laughed entirely too loudly at his polite, mild jokes. Arthur folded his magazine and suddenly wanted to enthusiastically discuss the stock market and investment portfolios. The shift in their dynamic was so violently sudden that it genuinely made my skin crawl. But the absolute worst change came from my younger sister. By the time we visited them for a second family dinner 2 weeks later, Chloe had undergone a truly bizarre metamorphosis. Gone were her usual neon crop tops and heavily distressed jeans. Instead, she was wearing a tailored navy blue blazer and a crisp silk white blouse, an outfit that was an eerie, much more expensive replica of my own daily work wardrobe. But she did not just steal my aesthetic. She aggressively tried to steal my intellectual space. Whenever Julian started talking about global market trends or complex financial laws, Chloe would violently insert herself into the conversation. She had clearly memorized top headlines from financial magazines that morning, just to drop meaningless buzzwords. Trying desperately to sound like a highly savvy businesswoman, she would lean over the dining table, entirely too close to him, and ask completely basic questions with wide, falsely fascinated eyes, treating his polite answers like absolute genius. Eleanor masterfully orchestrated these uncomfortable interactions like a seasoned theater director. During dinner, she would constantly find clever ways to subtly tear me down while building Chloe up to the heavens. "You know, Julian," my mother would say with a sickly sweet sigh, placing a hand on her chest. "Violet is so incredibly rigid. She is a hard worker, of course, but she has absolutely no sense of adventure. She is just tied to her cold computers all day long." Now, Chloe, on the other hand, she has the brilliant mind of a true entrepreneur. She is so adaptable, so vibrant and full of life. I always say a brilliant finance man needs a soft, highly creative woman to balance him out and keep him entertained. Do you not agree? She said it with a warm smile, pretending it was just a mother's harmless observation, but the underlying message was aggressively clear. I was the boring, dry, and entirely replaceable older sister, and Chloe was the exciting, perfect prize waiting to be claimed. Every single time Chloe giggled at Julian's jokes, every time Eleanor loudly praised my sister's completely non-existent business acumen, a cold, heavy knot twisted deep in my stomach. A quiet, persistent alarm bell rang in my head, warning me that something incredibly toxic was brewing right under my nose, but I forcefully pushed those dark thoughts down. I desperately told myself I was just being overly paranoid and jealous. I rationalized that my family was finally trying to be nice, that they just wanted my future husband to like them, and that my mother's cruel comparisons were just her usual, unfortunate lack of tact. I wanted so deeply to have a normal, loving family that I willingly blinded myself to the horrific trap they were carefully setting right in front of my eyes. My denial could only protect me for so long. The psychological warfare escalated subtly at first, then with a terrifying, calculated precision. Eleanor began organizing spontaneous family dinners, Sunday brunches, and formal evening cocktail gatherings. However, there was a glaring, undeniable pattern to her sudden and overwhelming hospitality. Every single event was scheduled exactly during my mandatory on-call hours for the main server upgrades at Nexus Core. When I called her to explain that I was locked in the highly secured data center for the next 8 hours and physically could not make it, her voice would drip with a sickeningly sweet, false sympathy. "Oh, what a shame, darling," she would say over the phone, sounding almost entirely too cheerful. "But Julian simply must come. It is absolutely crucial for him to bond with the family before the wedding. Do not worry about him feeling left out or bored. Chloe will take excellent care of her future brother-in-law." They thought Julian was a naive prize to be won, a wealthy, gullible asset they could easily separate from the herd and manipulate to their liking. They severely underestimated the man I was preparing to marry. Julian made his living hunting down ruthless corporate liars, analyzing complex psychological behavioral patterns, and detecting massive financial fraud. A 25-year-old amateur manipulator in a borrowed blazer was an absolute joke to him. One rainy Tuesday evening, while we were sitting quietly on my living room couch watching a documentary, Julian paused the television and quietly handed me his unlocked phone. The bright screen displayed a long, continuous string of messages from an unsaved number, but I recognized Chloe's excessively cheerful and emoji-filled typing style immediately. She was relentlessly inviting him out for private coffee dates, claiming she desperately needed expert advice for a brand new financial technology startup she was supposedly conceptualizing. The messages quickly and aggressively escalated from professional inquiries to blatant, highly inappropriate flirting. She sent him pictures of herself trying on tight, revealing dresses late at night, asking for his personal opinion on which one looked more professional for a late evening business pitch. She even suggested they fly to New York together for a weekend, so he could personally introduce her to his wealthy investor friends. "I have been entirely ignoring her for 3 weeks," Julian said, his voice deadly calm, completely devoid of any amusement. "Violet, your family is not just trying to be welcoming. Your mother is actively and intentionally trying to push me toward your sister, and your sister is eagerly playing along. I need you to open your eyes to what is happening right in front of you." A cold dread washed over me, a chilling realization that I was entirely alone in a room full of predators. But the romantic manipulation was only the surface level of a much deeper, far more terrifying sinkhole. 2 days later, I received a thick, formal envelope in the mail from my primary bank. I tore it open and stared at the crisp white paper in absolute confusion. The letter was a severe automated warning stating that my personal credit score had plummeted by over 150 points in the span of a single month. It was a massive, catastrophic drop, the exact kind of drop that completely destroys your ability to buy a house or secure a standard auto loan. It made absolutely zero logical sense. I paid off my credit card balances completely every 30 days. I had zero outstanding personal debt. I immediately called my mother, my heart hammering heavily against my ribs, frantically asking if any of the joint family utility accounts I helped manage had been compromised or left unpaid. Eleanor did not even hesitate to answer. Her response was smooth, utterly dismissive, and incredibly fast. "Oh, Violet, please stop being so ridiculously dramatic," she scoffed over the phone, entirely unbothered. "It is obviously just a temporary system glitch. You have been buying so many expensive things for the wedding lately, paying huge deposits to caterers and florists. The national credit bureaus always get incredibly confused when there is a sudden spike in spending. Just ignore the letter and throw it away. Do not let your pointless anxiety ruin your beautiful engagement period." I desperately wanted to believe her. I wanted to close the file, throw the warning letter into the trash, and go back to my quiet, highly ordered life. But the numbers simply did not add up, and in my professional world, numbers never lie. When I mentioned the frightening bank letter to Julian later that evening, the relaxed demeanor of a loving fiancé instantly vanished, entirely replaced by the razor-sharp intensity of a seasoned forensic investigator. He did not dismiss my worry or tell me to calm down. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a dark, professional suspicion. "A secure credit score does not mysteriously drop 150 points just because you paid a routine deposit for a wedding venue," Julian stated firmly, his tone shifting into full analytical mode. "That kind of drop is the absolute hallmark of massive, delinquent debt. Violet, I need you to let me run a comprehensive financial report on your entire background, every bank account, every hidden line of credit, every single digital footprint attached to your social security number. We need to do a deep dive into the Federal Credit Registry." I hesitated, letting someone, even my future husband, dig through the chaotic financial wreckage of my family felt incredibly humiliating. But the heavy, suffocating feeling in my chest, the undeniable intuition that something was catastrophically wrong, forced me to nod my head and quietly say yes. We agreed to start the deep audit the very next morning. I had to temporarily log into my main accounts to grant Julian legal proxy access. That afternoon, I was at my parents' house dropping off some printed wedding invitations when Julian called my cell phone to confirm he had successfully bypassed the initial security gates and was pulling the raw federal credit data. I spoke to him in the hallway, speaking in a low voice, entirely unaware that Eleanor was standing completely still in the adjacent kitchen, listening to every single word I said. When I hung up the phone and turned around, my mother's face was drained of all color. She looked exactly like a ghost. The smug, confident, deeply arrogant matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a trembling, wide-eyed woman gripping the edge of the marble kitchen counter so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. She did not ask me about the wedding invitations. She did not make a single sarcastic comment about my outfit or my hair. She simply spun around in utter silence, practically sprinting toward the backyard glass door, pulling her cell phone from her pocket with violently shaking hands. I stood completely frozen in the dark hallway, watching through the glass door as she aggressively dialed a number, pressing the phone to her ear. Her face violently twisted in absolute primal panic. I knew exactly who she was calling. She was frantically calling Chloe. In that chilling, perfectly silent moment, the scattered puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, creating a picture so horrifying it made my blood run entirely cold. They were not trying to steal Julian because they genuinely thought Chloe deserved a wealthy husband. They were not doing it out of twisted favoritism or petty jealousy. They were doing it out of sheer, unadulterated terror. Julian was a licensed forensic accountant. If I married him, our finances would legally merge, and he would inevitably look at my financial history. My family was desperately trying to force Julian to break off our engagement, desperately pushing him into Chloe's waiting arms, solely to separate him from my financial accounts. They were desperately racing against the clock to blindfold him before he dug deep enough to uncover the massive, rotting financial corpse they had secretly buried under my name. Thanksgiving dinner at the Collins household was always a grand, performative spectacle, but this year, the tension in the air was so incredibly thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. The massive mahogany dining table groaned under the heavy weight of an extravagant feast. There was an enormous roasted turkey, expensive imported truffles, vintage champagne, and elaborate silver centerpieces. Naturally, every single item on that table, right down to the linen napkins, had been entirely funded by my credit card. I had transferred $500 just 2 days prior when my mother frantically claimed she did not have enough cash to buy groceries. Yet, despite being the sole financial sponsor of this lavish holiday banquet, I was physically shoved to the absolute margins of my own family. While Arthur carved the meat at the head of the table and Chloe sat comfortably in a plush, velvet-cushioned armchair, I was relegated to a cheap, wobbly plastic folding chair squeezed tightly into the drafty corner of the dining room. I sat there quietly, pushing a small pile of mashed potatoes around my porcelain plate, hyper-aware of the frantic, nervous energy radiating from my mother. Julian was not there. He had told my family he was buried under a massive pile of federal tax documents and would not make it until much later in the evening for dessert. I had agreed to come alone, mostly to quietly observe them now that the blindfold was finally off. Halfway through the heavy, suffocating meal, Eleanor suddenly stood up. She grabbed a silver spoon and sharply clinked it against her crystal champagne glass. The sharp, piercing sound instantly silenced the room. She cleared her throat, smoothed down her expensive silk dress, and looked directly across the room at me. There was a desperate, chaotic frenzy behind her eyes, masked by a thin veneer of fake maternal concern. "Family," Eleanor began, her voice entirely too loud for the small dining room. "Thanksgiving is a time for brutal honesty and prioritizing the people we love. We have all seen the deep, undeniable connection over these past few weeks. It is incredibly clear to everyone in this room that you and Julian are fundamentally incompatible." She paused, taking a deep, dramatic breath, fully committing to the insane delusion she had constructed. "For the overall happiness of the family. Violet, you should call off the engagement. Chloe and Julian are true soulmates. They belong together. It is the right thing to do. And as your mother, I am explicitly telling you to step aside." The entire dining room plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. Arthur stared blankly at his plate. Chloe sat up perfectly straight, her eyes gleaming with a sickening, triumphant anticipation, fully expecting me to fold. They genuinely expected me to just nod, absorb the crushing humiliation, and quietly hand over my future husband the exact same way I had handed over my bank accounts for the last 10 years. I stopped pushing my food around. I slowly placed my silver fork down on the table. I sat up completely straight in my cheap plastic chair, looking directly into my mother's deeply unhinged eyes. All the years of silent compliance, all the buried resentment, crystallized into a singular, absolute freezing point. No, it was just one single word. I did not yell. I did not scream. But my voice was so devastatingly cold and utterly final that it echoed off the dining room walls like a gunshot. Eleanor's face violently contorted, the fake maternal mask completely shattered, revealing the feral, desperate monster underneath. She let out a guttural sound of pure rage, lunged across the corner of the dining table, and swung her arm with all her might. The open palm of her hand connected violently with my left cheek. The sharp, explosive crack of the slap rang loudly throughout the room. My head snapped entirely to the side. A sharp, burning pain instantly flooded my face, and a high-pitched ringing echoed deep inside my left ear. I tasted a sudden, metallic drop of blood where my teeth had forcefully bitten into the inside of my cheek. I slowly turned my head back to face them. Chloe leaned forward in her velvet chair, a cruel, mocking smirk twisting her lips. She did not look horrified. She looked thoroughly entertained. "Stop being so stubborn, Violet," Chloe sneered, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You are just the wallet of this house." Eleanor, entirely consumed by blind fury and my absolute lack of tears, raised her shaking hand high into the air to strike me a second time. She brought her arm swinging down toward my face. She never made contact. A large, deeply powerful hand shot out from the dark hallway and caught Eleanor's wrist mid-air with a crushing, inescapable grip. Eleanor gasped in sudden pain, her eyes widening in absolute terror. None of them knew that Julian had used a spare key to let himself in 10 minutes prior. None of them knew he had been standing quietly in the shadows of the dining room archway, witnessing every single second of their horrific betrayal. Julian stepped fully into the light. He looked massive in his dark winter coat. His jaw was tightly clenched, and his eyes were completely devoid of any warmth. He looked at my mother with a level of cold, terrifying disgust that made Arthur physically shrink back into his chair. With a sharp, violent motion, Julian forcefully shoved Eleanor's arm away, sending her stumbling backward until she crashed heavily against the wooden sideboard. Julian did not waste a single breath arguing with them. He did not yell or demand an explanation from people completely beneath his contempt. He walked directly over to my corner, gently placed his hand on my arm, and helped me stand up from the plastic chair. We did not look back. Julian carefully guided me toward the front door, walking straight out of the house and out into the freezing November night, leaving my stunned, paralyzed family trapped in the dead silence of their own making. The drive to Julian's apartment was consumed by an absolute, freezing silence. The heater in his car blasted warm air, but the chill inside my bones felt permanent. When we finally stepped into his high-rise apartment, he immediately locked the heavy deadbolt behind us. He expected me to break down. He expected me to collapse onto his leather sofa and sob into my hands after suffering such a brutal, humiliating assault from my own mother. But I did not shed a single tear. The violent slap across my face had not broken my heart. It had completely obliterated the last remaining shred of my blind familial loyalty, leaving absolutely nothing behind but pure, crystalline logic. My mind shifted into the exact same state it entered when a massive corporate server suffered a catastrophic failure. I needed raw data. I needed the root cause. I walked straight to my travel bag, pulled out my laptop, and sat down at his glass dining table. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the complex, 32-character password to my heavily encrypted personal archive. Julian did not ask if I was okay. He knew me far too well for useless platitudes. He simply pulled up a chair right beside me, flipped open his own dual-monitor workstation, and connected securely to his highly classified corporate network. We worked together in perfect, deadly synchronization. For the next 3 hours, His living room transformed into a makeshift, high-tech forensic laboratory. On my screen, I displayed the meticulously organized spreadsheets containing every single wire transfer, every cleared check, and every emergency credit card payment I had ever made to my parents over the past 5 years. On his monitors, Julian ran the raw, unfiltered federal credit data he had successfully extracted earlier that afternoon. He deployed advanced data matching algorithms, aggressively cross-referencing the exact timestamps and monetary amounts of my outgoing transfers with hidden public records, obscure court dockets, and encrypted banking nodes. The glowing screens illuminated the dark room as line after line of cold, hard evidence slowly materialized before our eyes. The first massive anomaly we uncovered completely shattered the long-standing illusion of my father's supposed medical emergencies and the incredibly expensive roof repairs. Julian isolated a specific cluster of massive wire transfers I had sent exactly 2 years ago. I had completely drained my emergency savings, transferring $35,000 because Eleanor had called me sobbing hysterically in the middle of the night, claiming Arthur needed an experimental out-of-network cardiac procedure that insurance absolutely refused to cover. "Look closely at the routing numbers. Violet," Julian instructed, pointing a silver pen at a highlighted row on his left monitor. "Your money never went to any medical facility. It never went to a roofing contractor either. These funds were funneled directly into a third-party escrow account managed by a prominent civil defense attorney." I stared unblinkingly at the screen, my blood running colder by the second. Julian quickly ran the attorney's name through a comprehensive legal database. The truth was entirely horrifying. There was no heart disease. There was no leaking roof. My younger sister, Chloe, had orchestrated a massive, fraudulent real estate investment scam on her social media pages, conning dozens of naive college students out of their hard-earned tuition money. The furious victims had banded together and prepared to file federal wire fraud charges against her. The $35,000 I had desperately sent home was used entirely to secretly pay off the victims in a desperate, under-the-table, out-of-court settlement, solely to keep Chloe out of a federal penitentiary. They had weaponized my deepest empathy to fund a criminal bailout. But the sickening discoveries did not stop there. The out-of-court settlement brilliantly explained the missing cash, but it did not explain the catastrophic drop of 150 points in my personal credit score. Julian's fingers aggressively pounded his mechanical keyboard, digging far deeper into the murky, heavily concealed depths of predatory lending networks. Suddenly, a massive, unredacted loan contract flashed across his right monitor. My breath violently hitched in my throat. Right there, in high-resolution black and white, was a horrific, predatory loan agreement issued by an unregulated offshore lender known for charging astronomical interest rates exceeding 35%. The principal loan amount was for an absolutely staggering $85,000. The primary applicant listed on the very first page was me. It displayed my full legal name, my exact date of birth, and my highly confidential Social Security number. "She stole your identity," Julian stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Chloe stole your Social Security number to legally secure this loan under your name." I scanned the terrifying document. The money was not used for any legitimate business. It was violently burned away to maintain her pathetic, fake influencer lifestyle on the internet. It paid for the first-class flights to Hawaii, the designer bags in Paris, and the luxury ski resorts in Aspen. I was literally funding her vanity trips, not through my cash gifts, but through stolen, highly toxic debt chained directly to my neck. But Chloe was completely unemployed. She had zero verifiable income. A predatory lender would never approve an $85,000 loan without a financially stable guarantor. I scrolled rapidly down to the final signature page of the digital document. There, scrawled on the guarantor line, was my signature. But it was not my handwriting. The loops were slightly too wide, the pen pressure completely wrong. I recognized that handwriting instantly. It was the exact same elegant, sloping cursive that signed my birthday cards every single year. My own mother, Eleanor, had willfully forged my signature to guarantee a predatory, high-interest loan for her golden child, knowingly and deliberately destroying my financial future in the process. In that quiet, dark apartment, surrounded by glowing monitors, the final, ugliest puzzle piece violently slammed into place. The entire picture was now blindingly clear. The bizarre, sudden shift in their attitude toward Julian, the aggressive pushing of Chloe into his lap, the Thanksgiving dinner ambush. It was never about them thinking Chloe was a better romantic match. It was about pure, unadulterated self-preservation. If I married Julian, our assets would legally combine. A forensic accountant of his massive caliber would naturally review my credit files to prepare our joint tax returns. The absolute second he ran my Social Security number, he would instantly discover the $85,000 fraudulent loan and the forged signature. He would know with absolute certainty that they were felons. The only possible way to silence Julian and keep him away from my heavily compromised financial records was to desperately force me to break the engagement. By pushing him toward Chloe, they hoped to keep his massive wealth within the family while maintaining absolute control over the narrative, keeping me entirely isolated in the dark so they could continue sucking my credit dry until there was absolutely nothing left. A dangerous, terrifying calm washed over my entire body. I was no longer a naive victim. I was a senior systems architect, and I was about to permanently dismantle a severely corrupted network. I spent the next 4 hours printing every single piece of damning evidence. Julian verified the digital forensic trails, ensuring every single printed document was legally bulletproof and entirely admissible in a federal court. We compiled a massive, 3-inch thick physical dossier. I then picked up my smartphone and drafted a highly urgent, confidential email to the senior corporate litigation attorney at Nexus Core Solutions, attaching a brief summary of the identity theft and requesting immediate legal counsel for the upcoming week. I was not going to yell. I was not going to cry. I was going to deliver a final, absolute ultimatum so utterly devastating that the Collins family would never, ever recover. Exactly 1 week after that catastrophic Thanksgiving night, Eleanor played her final, desperate card. She organized a massive, mandatory family intervention at their house. She invited absolutely everyone. My aunts, my uncles, and even my older cousins were summoned under the false pretense of a severe family crisis. Eleanor's strategy was painfully obvious. She intended to use the crushing weight of collective family pressure and public guilt to force me into total submission. She wanted the entire extended family to shame me into fulfilling my so-called filial duties, desperately hoping I would simply fold, come home, and quietly pay the looming debts to avoid a massive public scandal. When Julian and I confidently walked through the front door, the living room was packed. The air was incredibly thick with whispered gossip and highly judgmental stares from my relatives. The absolute second I stepped into the center of the room, Eleanor launched into a spectacular theatrical performance. She dramatically collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands, and began sobbing hysterically. She wailed loudly about how much she had sacrificed to raise me, how utterly ungrateful I had become, and how her heart was completely shattered. Through her loud, performative tears, she looked up and publicly begged me to just open one new, high-limit credit card to save the family from absolute financial ruin, claiming it was the only way to heal the deep, agonizing wound I had caused. My aunts and uncles nodded sympathetically, turning their sharp, disapproving glares toward me. They fully expected me to either yell defensively or break down in apologetic tears. I did neither. I walked calmly toward the heavy oak coffee table in the center of the living room, without uttering a single word. I raised the massive, 3-inch thick forensic dossier Julian and I had compiled and dropped it heavily onto the hard wooden surface. The loud, authoritative thud instantly silenced my mother's fake sobbing. The entire room went completely quiet. I maintained total, unblinking eye contact with Eleanor as I slowly flipped open the heavy black cover. I pulled out the first stack of highlighted papers and slid them across the table. "This," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion, is a legally binding out-of-court settlement. It legally proves that the $35,000 I sent you 2 years ago for Dad's fake heart surgery was actually used to pay off dozens of college students whom Chloe successfully defrauded in a massive internet scam. You continuously lied to me to keep your golden child out of a federal penitentiary. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the entire room. My aunts covered their mouths in absolute horror. I did not stop. I immediately pulled out the second crucial document. And this, I continued, sliding the predatory loan contract right next to the first pile, is an $85,000 high-risk loan from an offshore lender with a 35% interest rate. Chloe actively used my stolen Social Security number to secure it, and my own mother, Eleanor, willfully forged my signature to legally guarantee it. They used my stolen identity to fund luxury vacations while intentionally destroying my entire financial future. Eleanor's face instantly turned the color of cold ash. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. Chloe shrank entirely into the corner of the room, her arrogant, mocking smirk permanently erased, completely replaced by pure, wide-eyed terror. I turned to face my stunned relatives, sweeping my cold gaze across their utterly shocked faces. They did not want me to break my engagement because they genuinely believed Julian and Chloe were soulmates, I explained, projecting my voice so every single person in the house could hear the ugly truth. They forcefully pushed that entire disgusting narrative because Julian is a highly licensed forensic accountant. If we got married, he would naturally review my credit history and immediately discover their massive felony. Offering Chloe to him was just a desperate, pathetic attempt to keep him quiet and keep my bank accounts fully accessible to them. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of heavy, ragged breathing from the head of the family. My father, Arthur, slowly stood up. His hands were shaking violently. He had been completely content ignoring my emotional needs for 29 years, but looking at the undeniable, printed proof of federal fraud, the horrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down on him. He had absolutely no idea about the identity theft or the massive predatory loan. He turned slowly toward Eleanor and Chloe, his face violently twisted in absolute, furious disgust. He suddenly erupted, screaming at them, aggressively cursing his own wife and youngest daughter for secretly committing heinous, unforgivable crimes that could easily cost him everything he owned. I completely ignored the erupting chaos. I looked directly at my mother, delivering my final, unbreakable decree. I will not pay a single cent of that debt, I stated coldly, my voice cutting right through my father's furious yelling. You have exactly 24 hours to put this house on the market and figure out how to pay back the money you stole from me. If you do not, every single document in this folder will be sitting on the main desk of the Federal Bureau of Investigation tomorrow morning. I did not wait for a single response. I closed the empty binder, turned on my heel, and confidently walked out the front door with Julian right by my side. Behind us, the house completely exploded into a chaotic, vicious war zone of screaming relatives, a furious father, and two entirely broken manipulators violently tearing each other apart in blind, helpless panic. We got into Julian's car. He started the engine, immediately turning on the warm heater. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, looking out the glass window as the first gentle snowflakes of the winter season began to fall onto the dark Chicago streets. For the first time in 29 years, my chest felt incredibly light. There was no heavy burden of obligation, no lingering familial guilt, and no burning desire for a loud, dramatic physical revenge. I did not need to destroy them. I just needed to cut the heavy chains and let the absolute truth deliver its own brutal, flawless judgment. As the car pulled away into the quiet winter night, I finally felt completely free, and my soul was completely at peace. Thank you so much for listening to the very end of this story. We would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment down below. If you found today's story engaging and want to help keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. There, You can listen to our absolute best, highly detailed, and emotionally gripping exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code right here on the screen, or by clicking the link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you again for your incredible support, and we will see you in the next story.